Hey, my name is Owen Marsh. I'm 32 years old, and I fix pianos and old string instruments in a narrow shop on Main Street in Birch Hollow, Vermont, working at the same bench my father used before me. People in this town don't call me for comfort or advice. They call me when something's broken and they need it fixed before dark, because I'm the one who never says he's too tired to come. Birch Hollow is the kind of town where a man can go entire days talking only to people who bring in broken instruments, and for a long time, that suited me fine. My little brother grew up and moved down to Burlington 8 years ago and stopped needing me to be the one holding things together, and the quiet that came after felt earned, even if it echoed a little more than I wanted to admit some nights. It was a Thursday in late August, 20 minutes before I meant to lock up for the night, when the bell over my door rang harder than I'd ever heard it ring. The heat hadn't broken all day, the kind that makes the blacktop shimmer even after the sun starts going down, and the woman who pushed through the door looked like she'd run the whole way through it, shirt stuck to her back, loose strands of hair plastered to her neck. I knew her, not well. Josephine Ashworth, the one everyone in town called Josie, the one who used to bring her 2 kids to the community center every year for the recital, the one whose old baby grand I'd tuned twice since her husband died because she couldn't bring herself to sell it, and couldn't stand hearing it out of key either. I'd spoken to her maybe 6 or 7 times in my whole life. She was holding a folder against her chest so tightly her knuckles had gone bone white. "Owen," she said, and then stopped, like the rest of the sentence had frozen somewhere between her ribs and her mouth. I set down the bridge pins I'd been sorting and came around the counter. "Hey, what's wrong?" She looked at the door behind her like she expected someone to have followed her in, then back at me. When she finally spoke, her voice came out low and fast, the way people talk when they've rehearsed something in the car and are afraid that slowing down even once will make them lose their nerve completely. "I need you to marry me." I know exactly how that sounds. I have less than 2 days. I want to be honest about what went through me in that first second, because it wasn't shock exactly, and it definitely wasn't romance. It was the same fast, cold assessment I run whenever someone brings me an instrument that's been dropped down a flight of stairs, sizing up how bad the damage really is before deciding whether it can be saved at all. I didn't laugh. I didn't ask her to repeat herself. I pulled the stool out from behind the register and told her to sit before she said another word standing up, because whatever this was, it deserved more than the 2 of us standing in an empty shop with the closed sign already turned around. She sat. She didn't loosen her grip on the folder. "Start from the beginning," I told her. "Not the whole thing, just enough that I understand what I just heard. Daniel died a year ago tomorrow. My husband, Milo and Ruthie's father. He ran the loading yard at his family's mill, the one they've owned 3 generations, and there was an accident with the equipment, and that was it. I got the call at the elementary school, standing in the pickup line." She said it flat, the way people say things they've had to repeat often enough that the words have worn smooth, like river stones. I didn't tell her I was sorry. Something told me sorry wasn't what she'd come here for. Milo and Ruthie's biological mother, Daniel's first wife, died when Ruthie was barely 2, she went on. "I've raised both of those kids since, long before Daniel and I were married. Daniel's will named me as the children's first choice guardian, and the probate court granted me temporary guardianship while Walter contested it. But the will also incorporated a condition from the Ashworth family trust his grandfather set up decades ago, long before I was ever in the picture. If the surviving spouse hasn't remarried within 1 year of Daniel's death, the trust names the next Ashworth in line as successor guardian to raise the children, and I'm quoting this exactly, in a stable 2-parent household as the trustee sees fit, and lets him petition the court to replace me. The trust pays for the house, the kids' school, everything, and Walter's the trustee. Walter and his wife Evelyn live on the other side of town, and he's already filed that petition. It means if I'm not married by tomorrow, the probate judge could grant it, and the kids would move into his house across town by the end of the month. New school, new rules, a housekeeper instead of me putting them to bed. She looked up at me. My lawyer in Montpelier fought it every way he could find. The judge denied our final motion to prevent Walter from relying on the clause that afternoon. I kept believing the court would throw it out. I couldn't ask someone to marry a grieving woman with 2 frightened children until every other door had closed. My lawyer told me there was nothing left except the one thing the trust itself said would stop it. I sat with that for a second. Behind the counter, my phone buzzed with a text I didn't look at. "Why me?" I asked her. Not because I didn't want to help, because I needed her answer before I gave her mine. "I chose you because the children already know you, because everyone in Birch Hollow knows what kind of man you are. And because I believed that if the answer was no, you'd tell me without making me feel smaller for asking. Because you're the only person in this town I trust who isn't already tangled up in Walter's business somehow. Because you fixed Ruthie's toy piano for free the week after the funeral and never once brought it up like I owed you anything for it. Because I have 1 day left, and I'd rather ask a good man for something insane than lose my children to a man who's never once gotten down on the floor to talk to them at their level. I want to tell you I weighed that for a long time, turned it over the way I turn over everything before I decide. That isn't true. I've spent my whole life being the kind of person who moves first and sorts out the wreckage after. Ever since I was 14 and my mother left, and my father came apart quietly enough that somebody had to raise my little brother, and that somebody turned out to be me. I don't measure things twice when somebody's about to lose what matters most. I stood up, grabbed my keys off the hook, and said the only thing that made sense to either of us: "Let's go to the courthouse right now." She stared at me like I'd suggested something physically impossible. "Owen, this isn't a small favor. This is my whole life. My kids' whole life. I know exactly what it is," I told her. "That's why we're not standing here talking about it anymore. We're going." We didn't even make it out the door clean. I called Nathan Cobb from the truck, my oldest friend and the only lawyer in Birch Hollow who'd pick up his phone at 6:15 on a Thursday, and put him on speaker while Josie sat rigid in the passenger seat, with the folder still pressed to her chest, like it might blow away if she let go. Nathan listened for almost a full minute without interrupting, which for Nathan is close to a miracle. "Read me the clause exactly, word for word," he said. Josie read it in a voice that had gone thin at the edges. Nathan went quiet again. "Okay," he said finally. "The way that's written, it only cares about the fact of remarriage, not how long you've been together. Not whether it's love at first sight or a Tuesday afternoon arrangement. If you're legally married before the deadline, the condition Walter's whole petition depends on disappears. He can still try to fight your guardianship in probate court, Josie. He just can't claim the trust's 2-parent household provision was never satisfied. But Owen, if you're doing this, it has to hold up. It has to look like what it is. 2 people making a real choice, not a stunt for a judge to see through in 5 minutes. I glanced over at Josie. She was already looking at me. Neither of us said anything for a second, and the silence wasn't awkward the way you'd expect. It felt more like 2 people checking the same math and landing on the same number. We reached the clerk's office with 11 minutes left before it closed for the night. The woman behind the counter, who also served as one of Birch Hollow's justices of the peace, looked at the 2 of us, flushed and out of breath, glanced at the clock, and to her enormous credit didn't ask a single question she didn't have to. She agreed to stay a few minutes past closing. Harriet Doyle happened to be in the waiting chairs, dropping off a tax payment, and when she saw us come through the door holding onto each other's arms like we were bracing one another up, she stood before I even thought to ask, and said she'd stay with us until it was done, no explanation required. Nathan made it 15 minutes later, still in his office coat, holding a pen because that was the only thing he'd thought to grab on his way out. I didn't have a ring. Neither of us had thought that far ahead. All I had in my truck was a coil of soft copper winding wire, and, in my pockets, a receipt and a tuning fork. So I built something out of whatever was actually in front of me. I twisted a length of it into a loop, small enough for her finger, used a small file from my toolbox to smooth the cut ends so it wouldn't catch her skin, and told her it wasn't much, but it would hold until we could do better. She looked at it like it was the strangest, most serious object anyone had ever handed her, and slid it on herself before I could offer. The clerk read through the vows fast and flat, the way people read something they've read 1,000 times. When she asked if I took Josephine Ashworth as my lawfully wedded wife, I said I did, and meant every syllable of it more than I expected to, given that before she'd walked into my shop that evening, I hadn't known I'd be saying it at all. Josie's voice shook on her half, but it didn't break. Harriet cried without any embarrassment about it. Nathan checked the completed certificate before the clerk filed it, and looked at both of us afterward like he still couldn't fully believe what he'd just watched happen in the space of one evening. We didn't kiss the way people do in movies. I leaned in slow enough that she could have stopped me, and she didn't, and it was brief, and it was real. And when I straightened back up, she looked as surprised by it as I felt. There's no easy way to walk two children through what we'd just done, so I didn't try to make it complicated. Josie's friend Priya Anand had been watching Milo and Ruthie since the moment Josie called her from my shop in a panic. And when we walked into the Ashworth house that night, married, still damp from the heat of the walk up from the truck, Priya took one look at us and went very still. "You actually did it," she said. Josie nodded. Priya studied me for a long moment, the kind of look that measures a man and doesn't pretend otherwise. "You hurt her, or those kids," she told me, "and I will make your life difficult in ways no lawyer can fix." I told her that sounded fair. She almost smiled. Milo was 8, old enough to understand something enormous had happened, and young enough to be furious that no one had asked him first. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and asked flatly whether I was trying to replace his father. I told him no, and that I never would, and that the only thing I was trying to do was make sure nobody could take him or his sister away from his mother, and that if he wanted to be angry at me for showing up fast and messy instead of slow and careful, that was fair, and I'd still be there in the morning regardless. He didn't answer. He just watched me with an expression far too old for an 8-year-old's face. Ruthie, 5, had no such reservations. She was sitting on the living room floor with a small wooden toy piano that had lost half its hammers, the same one I'd fixed for free the week after Daniel's funeral, and when she saw me, she held it up like an offering. "It's broken again," she said. I got down on the floor beside her right there and told her I'd take a look. Milo watched from the doorway the entire time I worked, arms still crossed, saying nothing, but he didn't leave the room either. The next morning didn't go smoothly. Not exactly. I burned the eggs because I'd forgotten anyone besides me was in the kitchen, and Ruthie laughed so hard she nearly slid off her chair, while Milo ate his toast in total silence at the far end of the table, still deciding whether any of this was allowed to feel normal yet. Josie caught my eye through the smoke and didn't say anything, but something in her face had eased since the night before, like she'd slept properly for the first time in longer than one night. Nathan formally took over the guardianship case from Josie's lawyer in Montpelier that same morning. One more piece of paperwork in a day already full of it. Walter Ashworth found out about the wedding by the following afternoon, because in a town the size of Birch Hollow, news doesn't travel, it detonates. He didn't call ahead. He came to the house himself, in a suit that cost more than my truck, with his lawyer trailing half a step behind him, like a shadow that had learned to bill by the hour. Gordon Pierce introduced himself before Walter said a single word, which told me everything about which one of them usually did the talking in that family. Walter looked at me the way you'd look at a stain on something you'd expected to stay clean. "So you're the piano man," he said. "My son's wife tells me you got married yesterday. Quite a coincidence, given the timing." "It's not a coincidence," Josie said, before I could open my mouth. "It's the reason." Walter's eyes stayed on me. "And what exactly did it cost her," he asked, "to buy that kind of loyalty from a stranger?" Something in my chest went tight and cold, steadier than anger. "Nobody bought anything," I told him. "And I'm not a stranger to her children, whatever I might be to you." Gordon Pierce cleared his throat and said, with the practiced calm of a man who did this exact thing for a living, that they intended to argue before the probate court that a marriage entered into in less than 2 hours solely to defeat a trust provision could not satisfy that provision's actual intent, whatever the marriage certificate said, and that they intended to force us to defend the marriage's legitimacy before the court. Walter didn't wait for his lawyer to finish. He looked past me, at Ruthie's small shape half hidden behind her mother's legs, and for exactly 1 second, something in his face went almost gentle before it hardened again. "This isn't personal," he told Josie. "I'm doing what's right for them." She didn't flinch. "You're doing what's easiest for you to live with. There's a difference, and you know it." He left without saying goodbye to either child. Milo didn't say a word the whole time Walter was in the house, but the moment the door shut behind him, he walked straight past all of us to the piano in the front room and started banging out something loud and furious on keys that had nothing to do with any tune I recognized. Ruthie watched him, then looked up at me. "Is he mad at Grandpa or mad at you?" she asked. "Both, probably," I told her. "That's allowed." She nodded like the answer satisfied something in her and went back to her drawing. Ruthie asked me the next morning, completely out of nowhere while I was replacing a hinge on the pantry door, what she should call me now. "Not Owen," she said, because that felt too grown up, and not Dad, because she still had one of those, even if he wasn't around to answer the phone anymore. I told her she could call me whatever felt right, and take her time deciding, and that I wasn't going anywhere while she figured it out. She thought about it for the rest of the day and settled, by dinner, on Papa Owen, which satisfied some internal rule of hers I never fully understood and never once questioned. By the end of that first week, I'd learned the shape of their days well enough to fit myself into it without stepping on anyone. I picked Milo up from school on the afternoons Josie worked late at the Fenwick house, where she cared for an elderly patient. I figured out Ruthie liked her toast cut into triangles and refused it any other way. A few days after Walter's visit, trying to get ahead of the whispering that had already started building around town the moment his lawyer's car was seen in our driveway, I called a reporter I knew slightly from the county paper and gave a short quote defending Josie's character without asking her first, thinking I was protecting her from getting hit by rumors before they even landed. She found out when the reporter called the house directly for a follow-up question, and she was not grateful. "You don't get to decide what gets said about my life in the newspaper," she told me, voice tight in a way I hadn't heard from her yet. "Even if you meant well, especially if you meant well." I stood there feeling exactly as foolish as I deserved to feel. "You're right," I told her. "I did it because I wanted to fix something before it broke, and I forgot that fixing things without asking is its own kind of breaking. I'm sorry." She didn't answer right away. Then she said, quieter, that she appreciated the instinct, just not the execution, and that if we were going to do this, we needed to start deciding things together, out loud, even the fast ones. I told her that was fair. It was the first real argument we had, and somehow it made the whole arrangement feel less like an emergency and more like an actual marriage. 2 days later, the whole town got its turn to weigh in, whether we wanted them to or not, at the Birch Hollow Summer Festival on the town green, which I'd have skipped entirely if Milo hadn't asked, in his flat, careful way, whether I was coming, like he was testing something. I went. Josie went. We stood by the lemonade table trying to look like two people who'd been married a decade instead of 5 days, and for about 20 minutes it almost worked. Then one of Walter's cousins, a heavy-set man named Roland who ran the hardware store and owed his lease to the Ashworth family, as did half the storefronts on Main Street, made a point of walking past our table loud enough for half the green to hear him. "Some people will marry anybody," he said to nobody in particular, "if the house comes with it." A ripple moved through the nearest tables the way it does when everyone's pretending not to have heard something they heard perfectly well. Josie went very still beside me. I felt her hand find mine on the table's edge, not gripping it, just resting there like she needed to know it was solid. I could have said something sharp back at Roland. I wanted to. Instead, I looked at him and said, loud enough to carry exactly as far as his voice had, that I'd fixed pianos in half the houses in this town for free when people couldn't pay, including his own mother's upright the year she lost her job at the mill, and that if anyone here thought I'd started charging for kindness now, they were welcome to come ask me to my face, instead of over a lemonade table. Roland's ears went red. He didn't have an answer for that. Josie wasn't finished either. She looked at Roland and said, evenly, that she'd buried a husband, fought a court case alone for 11 months, and was still standing upright on that green, and that if he wanted to know what desperation actually looked like, it wasn't a widow accepting help from a decent man, it was a grown man needing to humiliate her at a summer festival to feel bigger than his own life. Roland didn't stay for dessert. Priya, who'd come to watch the kids' craft table, caught my eye across the green afterward and gave me a small, approving nod. The first one she'd given me since the night of the wedding. Milo, standing a few feet away holding a plate of cookies, looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him yet, something close to approval, though he'd have died before admitting it out loud. On the drive home, he asked, without looking up from his plate, whether Roland's mother's piano had actually been that bad. Worse, I told him. 3 dead keys and a crack in the soundboard. He almost smiled. It was the first almost smile I'd gotten out of him all week. 3 nights after that, a severe thunderstorm rolled in that the radio had been warning about for 2 days. The kind of summer system that snaps power lines across half the county and doesn't give the grid back until well into the next afternoon. Ours went dark around 10. I'd already learned enough about this house and this family in a week to know that a storm like this could set Ruthie's asthma off almost as fast as pollen season did, and that the machine she needed for her breathing treatments ran on electricity we no longer had. She started coughing around 11, the kind of cough that turns into something with a rattle underneath it, and within 20 minutes her breathing had gone thin and fast enough that every bit of color left Josie's face. Josie already had 911 on the phone, giving the dispatcher our address in a voice steadier than I felt. The roads were bad enough that an ambulance would take the better part of an hour, maybe more. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I went out to my truck in the wind and pulled the inverter I keep for job sites from under the back seat, the kind that runs off a car battery, and ran a line through the kitchen window. I had Ruthie's nebulizer humming again in under 10 minutes, kneeling on the floor while Josie held her against her chest. The phone still open on the counter, with the dispatcher talking her through what to watch for, and Milo stood rigid in the doorway with his hands balled into fists, like there was something in the room he could hit if he only knew where it was. It took another 20 minutes before Ruthie's breathing eased into something that didn't sound like it was tearing at the edges. The ambulance reached us nearly 90 minutes later. The paramedics checked her over, said the nebulizer had likely kept things from getting worse, and left instructions to call again if anything changed. Once they'd gone, I went outside with a flashlight and found a maple limb across the driveway. Nothing worse. When I came back inside, Milo sat down beside his sister and put his head against her shoulder. I understood, watching him, that some wall in him had come down that night too. The same one that had come down in Ruthie the day I fixed her piano. Later, once both kids were finally asleep, Josie and I sat on the porch step in the cooler air the storm had left behind, because it felt easier to breathe together out there than to sit silently in the house pretending neither of us was still shaken. Neither of us said much at first. Then she said, without looking at me, that she used to think she'd already used up every version of scared a person could feel the night Daniel died, and that tonight had found a new one anyway. I told her I understood that better than she probably realized. That fear doesn't run out. It just finds new shapes to wear. She turned to look at me. I don't know when this stopped being only about the trust for me, she said. Maybe it never fully was. It hadn't been only about that for me either, I told her. Not since somewhere around the second morning, watching you stand in that kitchen, deciding to keep standing no matter what the day threw at you next. I leaned toward her, and she met me halfway, like she'd been waiting for me to stop being careful about it. When we finally pulled apart, the last of the storm clouds were breaking up over the ridge, and for the first time since she'd walked into my shop with a folder pressed to her chest, neither of us was thinking about a deadline at all. When Milo came downstairs the next morning and found us still sitting at the kitchen table together, coffee gone cold between us, he didn't say anything about it directly. He just set an extra plate at the table without being asked, which from Milo was as good as a formal announcement to the entire household. Nathan called 4 days later with the kind of news that changes the whole shape of a fight. Using the annual trust statements and tax documents Josie had kept, along with additional records he'd pried loose through the probate court's emergency disclosure order, he'd spent the week combing through the trust's financial records and accountings. Records Walter had always managed personally without much outside oversight, and what he'd found wasn't a technicality. Walter had been quietly routing a portion of the trust's income back into the mill's own operating accounts for years, dressed up as management fees, roughly 4 times what any comparable trust would actually charge. It wasn't a small amount, and it wasn't recent. It reached back at least 4 years, beginning well before Daniel's death. That's not bad judgment, Nathan told us over the kitchen table. That's a trustee helping himself to money that belongs to his own grandchildren. Any judge who sees this is going to ask a lot harder questions about who's actually unfit to raise these kids. Walter didn't wait for that particular fight to start on its own schedule. 2 days after Nathan's call, the school phoned Josie in the middle of her shift at the Fenwick house to say that a man claiming to represent Walter Ashworth had come to the front office and attempted to sign Milo and Ruthie out early, citing Walter's position as trustee and his pending petition to become the children's guardian. The office had refused because the only people authorized to collect the children were Josie and, since the wedding, me. I got there roughly 4 minutes after Josie did. We found her standing in the school office practically vibrating with a fury I hadn't seen from her yet, while the man Walter had sent stood by the door looking like he badly wanted to be somewhere else entirely. I didn't say much to him. I didn't need to. The assistant principal, a steady older woman who'd clearly had enough of Ashworth family business spilling into her building, told him plainly that if anyone attempted that again without a signed court order, she'd be calling the sheriff next time, not asking politely first. He left without another word. Ruthie cried when she found out someone had tried to take her out of school without her mother there, and it took Josie and me most of that evening to convince her it wouldn't happen again, though neither of us fully believed that ourselves yet. Milo didn't cry. He just asked, in his flat, careful way, whether Grandpa Walter could actually do that, take them, if the judge decided the marriage didn't count under the trust. I told him the truth, that Nathan was making sure of the opposite, and that whatever happened in any courtroom, Nobody was walking out of this house with him or his sister, while I still had legs to stand between them and the door. He looked at me for a long moment, the way he always did before deciding whether to believe something completely, then nodded once and went to check on Ruthie. The emergency hearing came 5 days after that, in probate court, called at Gordon Pierce's request to settle it all at once, whether our marriage satisfied the trust's condition, whether Walter's petition for guardianship still had any legal ground left under it, and whether Josie's temporary guardianship of Milo and Ruthie would finally be made permanent. Judge Eleanor Voss ran her courtroom the way I imagined she ran everything else in her life, without a single wasted motion. Gordon Pierce spent the first 20 minutes making exactly the case I'd expected, that the marriage had been arranged in less than 2 hours specifically to defeat a lawful trust provision, that no court should treat less than 2 hours of paperwork as satisfying a condition meant to test something real. Nathan didn't dispute the timeline. He didn't need to. The trust's own language, he said, never specified how long a marriage had to last, only that one exist by the deadline, and a court couldn't add a courtship requirement to a document that wasn't there to defend itself. When Gordon Pierce asked Josie directly under oath whether she'd loved me the day she married me, she didn't flinch, and she didn't perform for the room either. "I didn't marry him because I loved him yet," she said. "I married him because he was the only person who looked at my children and saw 2 kids who needed a home, not 2 names attached to a trust fund. What grew after that is nobody's business but ours, and it grew anyway. Whether that satisfies this court's idea of romance, I can't say, but it's the truest thing I've got." Judge Voss listened to all of it without any expression at all. Then she turned to Nathan and asked whether the defense had anything further to submit regarding the trust's administration, and Nathan stood and handed the clerk the file he'd been building since the night of the wedding. The management fees, the routed income, years of numbers that told a story Walter had clearly never expected anyone outside his own accountant to read closely. Walter's face didn't change much while it was read into the record, but his hands did. He gripped the edge of the table hard enough that his knuckles went pale, the same way Josie's had the night she walked into my shop. When Judge Voss finally addressed him directly, her voice stayed level, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, "this court takes seriously any claim that a marriage was entered into in bad faith. It takes equally seriously evidence that a trustee has been diverting funds meant for minor beneficiaries, disguised as fees no comparable trust would ever charge. I am not persuaded that a man attempting to invoke a decades-old remarriage clause against a grieving widow while quietly siphoning that same widow's children's inheritance comes to this court with entirely clean hands." She let that settle in the room for a moment before she went on. "The marriage between Josephine Ashworth and Owen Marsh stands as legally valid, and it satisfies the trust's condition regardless of how quickly it was made. Josephine Ashworth's guardianship of Milo and Ruthie is made permanent. Walter Ashworth's petition to be named their guardian instead is denied, and I am ordering a full independent forensic accounting of the trust, effective immediately." Somewhere behind us in the gallery, I heard Harriet Doyle let out a breath she must have been holding for the entire hearing. Walter stood so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. "This is because of her," he said, not quite shouting, but close, pointing at Josie like she'd personally engineered the outcome. Judge Voss didn't raise her voice to match his. "Mr. Ashworth, this is because of your own signature on 4 years of trust accountings. Sit down, or I'll have you removed from my courtroom." He sat. Gordon Pierce looked like a man calculating, in real time, exactly how much of this case he still wanted his name attached to. Outside on the courthouse steps afterward, Josie stood very still for a long moment with her eyes closed, like she was checking whether the ground underneath her had actually stopped moving. Then she opened them, looked at me, and said the only thing either of us needed to say out loud right then. "We still have them." I told her we did. She laughed, and it came out half a laugh and half a sob. And Milo, who'd been allowed to skip the last 2 hours of school to be there, stepped in close and put his arms around both of us at once, without any of the careful distance he'd kept around me the first week after the wedding. Walter never came to the house again. The court-ordered forensic accounting confirmed exactly what Nathan's file had promised it would. And by spring, the probate court had formally removed Walter as trustee, ordered him to repay what he'd diverted, and appointed an independent professional trustee to look after the children's inheritance instead. I heard, secondhand, that he still asks Priya's husband, who does deliveries out to the mill, how the children are doing, though he's never once asked to see them himself. Milo started coming out to the shop with me on Saturday mornings not long after the hearing, first just to watch, then to actually hand me tools, then, by early spring, to help me restring a beat-up guitar someone had dropped off, while I guided him through every step. He never said much about why he kept coming. He didn't have to. The wire ring lasted 4 months before I replaced it, at Milo's insistence more than Josie's. He picked it out himself at the jeweler's 2 towns over, took the whole decision as seriously as he takes everything, and told me afterward, with the particular gravity of a boy who'd decided to trust someone completely, that if I was going to be around this long, I ought to do it properly. I told him I planned on it. I've thought a lot since then about what actually makes a family, and I don't think it's blood, and I don't think it's paperwork either, though we've got the guardianship order framed in the hall alongside our marriage license. I think it's just showing up enough times in a row that somebody stops flinching when you walk through the door. One evening this past June, almost 2 years since the night Josie first walked into my shop with her hair damp from the heat and a folder pressed to her chest, Ruthie sat at the little wooden piano in our front room, the same one with the once broken hammers, picking out a song I'd taught her note by note over a dozen quiet evenings. Milo sat nearby, pretending to read, but clearly listening to every note. Josie stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and an expression I'd come to know better than any other I'd ever learned to read. When Ruthie finished the last note clean, she spun around on the bench, grinned up at me, and asked if I'd fix the piano again someday, if it ever broke. "I'll fix anything in this house," I told her, "for as long as you need me to."